everyone. I'm going to kick us off. Welcome to our October webinar. We played a little Michael Jackson, spooky season, Halloween. I hope everyone was dancing at home. I'm Lexi. If you're new to our webinars, I kick us off and then I'm going to disappear. Thank you to everyone that is here on this Wednesday. Roughly 500 of you. That's amazing. We've got a lot to talk about and only 60 minutes. So first and foremost, just some housekeeping things. One, yes, this webinar will be recorded. If you're registered, which you are because you're here, we will send that recording out over email, likely later today or tomorrow morning for some of you. It will also be posted to our resources page on wpengine.com, and it goes on our YouTube. So lots of places to rewatch. In addition to that, we do link out the transcripts. So we've got a great panelist full of experts here, and anything they name drop or any programs they mention, we will link those out. So don't worry about trying to take notes or do anything there. Next thing, we will be taking questions during the webinar. Please, if you have questions, put them in the chat, or we prefer in the question and answer section. That way we can filter through them and grab them easily to ask our panelists at the end. Just a real quick recap. Today, we're talking about security, but we did do a webinar last month on performance. Security and performance in WordPress and on the web are very, very related. So if you want to check out that webinar, a lot of the things we mentioned today were also applicable in the September webinar, and you can access that on our website. For a quick agenda, I'm going to hand it over to our host, the lovely Crystal here in just a moment, and she's going to take you through Security 101, like some basics you should need to know, just like a quick list. And then she's just going to talk about WP Engine offerings in security as a hosting provider. And then what we're all here for is this panel. We're going to ask these panel of experts some questions on security and data privacy and everything in between. And then we will take your questions. So without further ado, Crystal, I'd love to hand it over to you. Can you introduce yourself, what you do at WP Engine, and then take us through the rest of the webinar?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Crystal O'Connor. So glad to be behind the mic with you all today and working with this wonderful panel. I'm Crystal O'Connor, and I'm Senior Product Manager at WP Engine, and I work on our Edge Network platform. So the entry point to a visitor reaching your site, that's where I live. James, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. So I'm James Brown. I'm a digital director at Flipside Group in the UK. As a business, we kind of really embrace the power of tech, and in particular in terms of digital transformation for all our clients through apps, web, kind of AX kind of technologies more recently. And kind of personally, I focus on the web and API side of what we do for our clients. I come from a developer background, predominantly Microsoft technologies, so don't all start shouting in the chat and throwing things, but as far as concerned here, security, it's kind of the same across all platforms. So got some great stuff to talk about in terms of my experiences across lots of our big client kind of customer facing websites, and some of our more kind of hidden clients, but more business to business. So hope you're all looking forward to it.
Excellent. So glad to have you here today. Scott, you're up. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure thing. Hello, everyone. I'm Scott Jones. I'm the CEO at Illustrate Digital. I founded the agency around almost 10 years ago, 10 years in December, which is quite exciting to almost be reaching that milestone. We're an enterprise specialist agency that work in WordPress. And we also do user research and user experience as well. So we're all about creating frustration-free and engaging experiences on the web, and that's what we're focused on. We also have recently, or I think actually earlier than WP Engine might have done, joined the ISO 27001 club, which is an international certification for security. So hopefully I can lean into a little bit of that experience today and share our view.
Fantastic. Thank you for being here today. Alon, you're up.
Thanks, Crystal. Hi, everyone. My name is Alain Schlesser. I'm the Director of Technology and Innovation with XWP. XWP is a distributed agency for enterprise WordPress. headquartered in Australia, but distributed across the globe. I'm a software engineer by trade, currently working more as a general technologist. And today I wanted to share some insights about some of the security topics that are often overlooked, and also about data privacy and data governance and how that relates to security and what you should be aware of in that regard.
Fantastic. This is going to be an awesome conversation. I can't wait to get to it. So let's go ahead and get started. Did you all know that more than half of all cyber attacks target small businesses? A lot of people that I talk to think that this happens to big organizations, because that's what we hear about in the news, right? But DDoS attacks, out-of-date WordPress themes and plugins. I have a question about that for the panel. SQL injections and cross-site scripting attacks. These kinds of things can happen to small businesses and individual sites as well. So security really is something that's important for us to keep in mind, no matter how big or small we really are. What are some of the things that you need to be aware of? Security is always evolving and it's always changing. So keeping up to date on what's happening out in the world and how you can mitigate those attacks is really important. Maintaining good backups. At WP Engine, we do back up your sites for you. But if you're going to make a change, or if you're trying to fix a thing or update a plugin, maintaining backups is really important. We're going to talk a little bit about user management. That also is really important. And the impact of insufficient security. What happens when things go wrong? Change is part of the process. Change from upgrades to updating your knowledge. What are some of the principles of security behind that? Confidentiality of data, for example. Integrity and availability. The principle of least privilege, kind of that idea of need to know or need to have access, maintaining that least amount of privilege for that user as is necessary for them to do whatever it is they need to do. These are all important principles to keep in mind. Updates are vitally important, and we are going to talk about this in our panel today. But WordPress runs on what is often called a LAMP stack. So we're talking about Linux, Apache or Nginx, MySQL, PHP. And it's just important to make sure that you or your host is keeping up to date with things like MySQL and PHP on the server, just as it is important to keep up to date with WordPress and WordPress plugins and WordPress themes. But before you make those updates, make sure you run a backup, because if something goes wrong, or maybe there's an incompatibility or something gets a little funky, you want to make sure that you can always go back and restore that backup. Before you make any changes, always back up your site. What about user management? User management is really important, not just because of maintaining your circle, so to say, but also because if an attack were to happen, what can that user be used to do a thing? So we want to make sure that we're using really strong passwords so that a password can't be guessed, and maybe somebody with administrative privileges is suddenly used as a vector into your site. Two-factor authentication. We get notified to use two-factor authentication on so many sites and web applications today. It's just as important on your site to help keep those users secure. Change your login path. So site.com/WP login. Change that to something like site.com/some obscure name here, so it's not so easy to guess. And monitor your user activity. Gee, I thought that person was on vacation all week, but they seemed to be logging into the site pretty often. I wonder what's going on there. Just monitoring that activity and making sure that it seems normal, and making sure that your users have the right privilege for the job they need to do. Pick a good partner. Who you are hosting your site with can help make sure things like MySQL and PHP stay up to date. They may even be able to help you with things like WordPress upgrades and plugin upgrades to make sure that it's really easy for you to stay up to date. Or maybe they're providing you with automated daily or nightly backups, all very important. Maintaining SSL certificates, web application firewalls, in case you were wondering what WAF stood for. Even third-party audits. These are all really important, and your host can help you with those things. What is the impact of a security breach? If something were to actually happen to your site, how can that affect you? It can affect you in a number of ways, from brand impact and trust, or identity theft if there is a data leak as part of the attack in that case. Data loss, for example, if you have to restore backup in order to mitigate an attack on your site, do you lose orders that are stored in your database because you're now going back to a period before? And just generally business disruption, which can cost time and money. So taking a look at WP Engine and security overview. Site maintenance is site security. So if you look at that circle there on the right-hand side, vulnerabilities by component, WordPress actually takes the smallest amount of the pie. WordPress itself isn't too shabby. Themes are around 5%. Plugins are 92% as a vector to security problems on your site. So how do you manage that? Offerings such as the Smart Plugin Manager, which will back up your site and then automatically update plugins that can be updated. It's a really great way to help stay on top of plugin updates. WP Engine also runs vulnerability scans and will notify you if it detects that a plugin exists on your site that has a known vulnerability, so you can take action. We also maintain MySQL PHP for you automatically. We'll let you know when upgrades are coming, and you can choose your PHP version right in the user portal, making sure you're staying on a secure version. And they also do WordPress updates to make sure you're up to date with the most secure version. Leave WordPress security to the experts. So we're going to talk a little bit about starting at the entry point all the way down into the application. And here you're looking at the attacks or just general traffic coming in through the network and then down into the application. So we offer Global Edge Security, which is an add-on over at WP Engine. And Global Edge Security offers managed web application firewall and advanced DDoS protection. We're going to get into a little bit about DDoS, what that is, and what kind of symptoms do you notice on your site when it happens? The web application firewalls can help mitigate that, and Global Edge Security as an add-on offers that as a solution to help mitigate those potential attacks. All right, so again, hi, I'm Crystal, and we have James, Scott, and Alon joining us today. We're going to have a fantastic conversation. Let's see. Yep, we're going to have a fantastic conversation about security today. So hello, friends. How are you all today?
Really good, thank you. Thank you for inviting me here.
Absolutely. So glad to have you all here. So the first thing that I want to talk about today is we're talking about security for our WordPress websites. But security doesn't just start and stop with WordPress itself. We just talked about a couple different things, from networks to PHP and MySQL. It's really multifaceted. Let's talk about some of those areas or layers at which we need to be thinking about security. James, would you like to start us off today?
Yeah, sure. So as you say, the application is what everyone sees. Ultimately, they load the browser, they load the app, and they see a website. So they assume that that is the product, right? But as you say, there are so many layers before that product, if you like, is even delivered to an end user. So as soon as that request is made for a URL, for example, it's likely to go through, as you said, maybe Cloudflare or Akamai's or other products offering an edge service for protection against denial of service attacks or any other kind of bad player kind of traffic. And then through various caching, through various other systems, middlewares, et cetera, which all have a part to play in the security profile of your product. So from my experience, we work a lot with Akamai, so offer very similar services to Cloudflare. And that's where we like to make sure that there is huge amount of security there. That's your front door, right? That's you don't leave your front door of your house open or your windows open, right? So that's what you're looking at, making sure that as much of the bad traffic is stopped there. And those tools have so many features built into them that you don't really need to do much. You install and you pay, right? And then you configure it as you go.
Right.
Just on what you said there, James. Someone shared an analogy with me a while ago around. I mean that I hadn't seen those stats around the number of plugins versus the percentage of plugins versus WordPress itself, which is quite good to see actually, because it does match what we see as an agency and the sort of thing that we end up dealing with and looking after. But someone gave me the analogy of it's like having more windows in your house, and the more windows you have, the more entry points there are to break in through. So generally, you want to keep the number of plugins that you've got to a minimum, and that way you can take more control of the issues that might occur with those plugins, the updates on those plugins, but also the things like you said before that those plugins actually have control over and doors into within the rest of the website and third-party platforms as well.
Yeah, definitely you want to reduce the surface that is possible for attack as much as possible, and probably with the layers like the network layer and the physical layers, the application layer, you can basically think about it like a negative market funnel. Like with a marketing funnel, you have a larger starting base and it gets narrower and narrower as you go down. Just the point with the security funnel is that you want to have the least amount of people ending up at the bottom of the funnel instead of the most amount of people. Ideally, the first layer is the one that filters out the most, because it's also the cheapest one to filter out in terms of resources needed. And it's also the one that gives the least amount of potential for further breakage when it's being pummeled by DDoS attacks or something like that. So you don't want to have bad actors hitting your server as much as possible. So ideally, get rid of them at the network level straight away, so your server is never even aware of it. So you don't need to prepare your application server for that scenario at all.
I'm just thinking, if I'm really crystal about zooming out a little bit further, you said, that the security doesn't necessarily start with the website or with WordPress or indeed with WP Engine. And if you zoom out to the wider business and the business relationship, whether that's an internal IT or development team, and the marketing team, or whether that's a freelancer and their client or an agency and their client, I think the accountability between the two sides is really important there, and actually understanding and being clear with each other about who is looking after what. Is the agency looking after the DNS and the Cloudflare and that aspect, and is it our responsibility to update plugins, or is it something you're going to do? Just making sure that you've got every single base covered, and almost writing yourself a checklist of all the things that you should do every time that you launch a new site or work with a new client. Having that, I'm not a massive fan of having too much process, and it can get in the way of progress sometimes, but actually having some of those processes there that make sure you tick the boxes, particularly from an accountability and conversation perspective, it can really help to stop those gaps from actually appearing later on down the funnel that Alain's talking about there, so that, yes, actually the right person updated the plugins at the time they said they would, or, the Cloudflare setup was done correctly, or WP Engine relationship was owned, or whatever that may be. But that, goes across an entire business or an entire, freelance, book, if you like, not just a specific website or specific instance.
Yeah, it does. And we're so used these days to building sites kind of like mobile first, for example. Everyone knows that phrase. Yeah. And it's the same with security, right? Security needs to be first. You know, there's so many house analogies that are, you know, that you can bore people with, but you don't start building a house by the roof, right? You start at the foundations. And that's all these things that Scott was just talking about in terms of those processes and who's responsible for what. You know, they're your foundations of any site you build. And you get those right, you get those in place, and everyone's on board with those. You know, whatever you build on top of those, you know, might not be what customers want and might look shocking, but at least it's going to be secure.
We're really talking about security as a mindset and making and building habits and building a muscle around that inside yourself and inside your organization, right?
Yeah. I think historically, I think security always, I say historically, I'm in my 40s now, so I'm talking right back at the beginning of building websites. Security, what people didn't think of security, you know, they built a website, they threw it up, they didn't really kind of think about what people could then do to that data that was being collected, or, you know, how it could be impacted. And, you know, it's so important, not, you know, for many years, but, you know, particularly, you know, at the moment with lots of kind of big kind of attacks going on and stuff, you know, there's lots to consider.
I love that.
That's an interesting point. So if I think back about how, in the olden days, websites were built. So mostly the application was not really an application at that time. It was mostly static HTML with some CSS that you built. And now with the way a modern web application is built, it's really much more like a full client-server application. Where there's so many interconnected pieces that communicate with each other. And so the security needs to happen not only at the web serving end, so that you just need to secure your LAMP stack, but you actually need to secure all the communication that's happening between these components, which is another area of the network layer that needs to be secured as compared to when you just had a static HTML site. So once your web server was secure, you were good. Nowadays, while your application is sending requests back and forth between the browser and several different types of servers that are probably making up your system, it's getting much more complex to care about that. And you need to really think about a systematic approach to cover that and have rigid processes in place, because otherwise you just lose track of what is happening behind the scenes very easily.
So let's take a look at that funnel in the top of the funnel. For those who may not be familiar, there's all different kinds of attacks that can happen at the networking layer. Things like ping of death attacks. Oh, that's really ominous. I guess it's almost Halloween. SYN flood attacks and DOS or DDoS. Can we talk a little bit about what a DDoS attack is and what kind of symptoms might you notice when something like that is happening?
Yeah, so I jump in. Yeah, so I mean, we one of our clients is constantly under attack, right? So they are a big pizza chain, and they're constantly under attack. And what we see, and obviously we've got all these systems in place. So to be fair, we don't see them anymore. In reality, they happen, but they're kind of defended against at the edge, right? But many years ago, you know, the first we would really realize about this was all our alerts would fire off. Everything would go red. We'd have text messages saying CPU was up to 100%, and kind of response times are really slow, and you know, everything could be firing off. And you know, everyone kind of jumps on it and, oh, what's wrong, you know, servers are sluggish, no pages are loading, and whatever. And you start eventually then to kind of look at the picture, get into the logs, and realize that, wow, why is my log file 700 megabytes now when it's normally 200? You know, what's going on? And yeah, you get to the root that there's, you know, a massive amount of traffic and a kind of traditional DDoS attack, which is just kind of, you know, volume led. Huge amount of traffic, maybe to targeted pages, which attackers have realized are more kind of resource hungry than others, but generally from, you know, massive spread of IP addresses, big spread of pages, user journey, etc. Yeah, and so it looks quite quite drastic. It looks like, your server is dying.
It can feel like it too.
Yeah.
Alana, I'm gonna pick on you for this. Let's say I have a site and it's experiencing a DDoS. What are some of the things I might have in my, some might call it a doomsday playbook, to help get things back online, to mitigate the situation, but then also how does it affect my reputation as a brand or as an organization after the fact?
Yeah, so let me get to the first part of that first. So with a DDoS attack, usually you want to first mitigate it, because you will have time to do any forensics, any root cause analysis later, but the most important part is to be able to properly deflect and mitigate it in the initial onslaught, because while the attack is happening, chances are good that not only is this causing a lot of problems, strain, and extra costs to your systems, but also probably you're not available to your visitors, your clients anymore. So if you're running an e-commerce site, for example, people will not be able to buy anything while this is going on. So usually there's several ways of deflecting that, but what I recommend generally is that if you're responsible for an application, for example, if your core business is not managing servers, then you should not be the one trying to do that. You should have a strong partner on your side, like WP Engine for hosting, for example, where you immediately let WP Engine know. Probably they already figured that out, because they will also have their alerts pop up all of a sudden. And then also have systems in place like Cloudflare and Akamai, which have on one hand a protective layer that can also already protect against some of that. And they also have the mechanisms in place to help you immediately block traffic based on some criteria, or reroute traffic to other servers, adapt the load balancer and things like that. So there's different ways to mitigate that immediately, to deflect that. But you should ideally have the systems in place already before that starts. If all you have is a physical server you're running yourself that you put on the internet, you're in a really tough spot to be able to properly handle that. So all of these protective systems to properly deal with a serious DDoS attack, they need to be in place up front. So this needs to be an infrastructure that is already planned and implemented in such a way that you have ways to fight for your server in case a scenario like that happens, because otherwise there's not, you can always work on the network, on the DNS layer and things like that. But probably if you didn't plan for that, you will not get to a point where your visitors and your clients can get access to a server while this is ongoing. You can just basically take your server offline and wait for it to stop. That's mostly what you can do in such a scenario.
Because you can't even put up a, sorry, we'll be back later page. You're literally stuck.
Yes, exactly. So these systems need to be in place up front. Otherwise, you're in a really tough spot. And then in case something like that happens, so for example, being offline for several hours or even worse can have an immediate negative impact on your business, of course. And also, you need to consider that nowadays people are being more and more aware of what a security breach means, what that might entail. And even if nothing bad actually happens, apart from being offline, people will already have doubts about what the impact has been behind the scenes. And you will also have a hit on your reputation, even if it's unwarranted. So this is a situation that you'd likely want to avoid in the first place by having the means to immediately switch to alternative ways of dealing with the traffic, so that you can mostly keep your systems online and available for your clients.
It's been a genuinely long time since I, as a CEO, last heard of any of our clients directly for myself having an issue with a DDoS attack that made it public or had an impact externally. But I guess that's also probably as a result of WP Engine doing such a great job, and probably worth talking about for a second the rule sets that they have in place compared to just going and getting an AWS instance of your own and pushing the site out there and hoping to self-manage it, because the specialism within WordPress that WP Engine has is the extra little source there that we're coming to them for to make sure that that's covered, that any known issues, any known vulnerabilities are covered off and already taken care of. And I think that tends to be our recommendation, is exactly what Alan just said there around having a really good hosting provider and a really good layer of support behind that, which of course my team do for our clients. We do a lot of our work in the legal sector, financial service sector, fintech, banking, professional services, government. So in those industries particularly, it's even more important from a credibility and reputation perspective. And that's, the majority of the time, the conversations we're having around the need for the website, of course, is partly to do with converting potential leads and signing up customers and that side of things, but it also is about credibility and reputation. And so, the longer a website is offline, the worse that gets for their credibility, the worse that gets for their reputation. And people start to ask questions, and if it's there for long enough, the news will pick it up and it'll become a much bigger deal than it actually needs to be. And it does start to create those question marks. So, removing the possibility of those question marks being created is really what we're trying to do when we're, doing all of this great security work to get ahead of those issues.
Yeah, and that kind of reputational stuff really sticks, and it is hard then to I don't mean recover like it's gone forever, but it's hard to get back to where you are. It's a slow process, and the kind of FMCG brands that we work with at Flipside, you of course you lose that immediate transaction, so that that person's not buying at that moment, especially when it's a kind of impulse purchase, which some of our customers are. They that you've lost that purchase, but then they've gone to a competitor brand, then you potentially lose that customer for potentially for their lifetime, right? And over X number of years of that customer buying pizza for once a week, it's a lot of money. So there's a much longer tail in terms of the financial impact, and then obviously the reputational damage off the back of it.
So we've talked a little bit about the edge, about the networking side of things, and the reputational hit and other business applications for if something were to happen at the networking layer. Let's take a little look at the application side of things. We saw a chart earlier that talked about vectors of 3% really coming in on the WordPress application itself, 5% on themes, and then 92% on plugins. Can we speak a little bit about, right? Can we speak a little bit about why plugins are such a vector and what we can do to mitigate that? Scott, I'm going to pick on you to lead that one off.
Yeah, sure. I guess I mentioned earlier on that, it's worth initially and periodically auditing the need for plugins. So we tend to try to suggest to put as few as possible on your website if you can. But of course, we also understand the beauty of WordPress is its extensibility. So a lot of WordPress admins out there can go wild on adding plugins, and even when you look at maybe without naming any of them, you may look at like potentially a form plugin, and that plugin's got a number of different extensions that you can add to it, and the same for e-commerce, and there's a number of different extensions. So it's very tempting to immediately start to add a high number of plugins for that functionality. I guess the way I would look at it is, do you really need that functionality? Is that mission critical? Is it conflicting with something else that you are also doing somewhere else? Are you doubling up on functionality? And also, is it possible to do what you're doing with hard code without having to put too much more effort into doing that? So If it's something that you can do without opening another window in the house, and it's something that you can do internally, to put it in that perspective, then, you know, definitely try and do it internally, because that's a lot more secure. So, you know, they're the initial things that we would say. But also there's a few tips, I guess, that you can look at in terms of when you're choosing and selecting those plugins. And so the couple of things I think you want to look at are, or maybe three things you want to look at is, who was the developer of that plugin? Do they have a degree of reputation in the industry? Is it the brand themselves? And if it's the brand themselves, then that's a pretty good sign usually. You know, if you're putting a review plugin on the website and it's from that review brand, it's usually you know, a good one to trust. The second thing is, how many reviews does it actually have on that plugin in the repository, in the WordPress repository? So, you know, are people saying good things, bad things about that plugin particularly? And the third one would be, and probably the most important one, when was it last updated, and what version number is it relevant for? So if you look at a plugin that's got 5 stars, but it was only updated 2 years ago, probably one to avoid, because no one's looked at it, tested it, and made sure it's not vulnerable in the last 2 years, which is not a good sign at all. In fact, a good practice would be, if you operate a plugin and you haven't had any vulnerability opportunities in the last 2 years, just do a small update anyway, because showing that you've actually tested it and run an update recently is a pretty good sign. So there's a few different things that you can do there to make sure that you're treating plugins well, but just audit them regularly as well. Go back to them, don't forget about them. Make sure that you're you know, ensuring that you've got the right set of plugins actually installed to begin with.
Yeah, I think because they're easy to install and there's kind of whole kind of library of them, people I think assume that they all work and they're all as good as each other, and it doesn't really matter what I add because I can add it, you know. And like you say, Scott, that you know, you need to work out whether they are needed, and they need to kind of fight their own corner, right? They need to prove that they're needed. And yeah, you know, there's crazy stories of, you know, JavaScript libraries where you've got plugins that are, you know, is this number odd, you know, and, you know, I'm sure that's a joke, that plugin, but, you know, the point remains that, you know, there are some plugins which do actually under the hood some very simple things that you could do yourself, and therefore you haven't opened yourself up, or you say, oh, you haven't opened another window of attack.
I just want to quickly note that there's no technical answer to the question how many plugins is too much or too few. Well, too few will never have too few plugins. So technically, all that happens is that there's a PHP file being loaded. So having 1,000 plugins or having 1,000 PHP files in one plugin doesn't make any difference. It's not the exact number for technical reasons. But having 1,000 different plugins on your website, it can technically it can run just fine, but you're making 1,000 bets of every single one of these plugins being flawless in their security practices. And if you combine that with the fact that a lot of the WordPress ecosystem is grown out of hobbyist ambitions and not out of serious engineering practices. This bet, if you make it too many times, there's actually a high probability of being wrong at least once. And that is enough to cause real issues. At XWP, we generally try to have as few plugins as possible, but not only for security reasons, but also for scalability reasons. Because at a certain level of scale, you quickly find out that almost all plugins in the WordPress space, they are just not built in a very scalable way. So there's other issues that you notice with plugins. So we tend to custom code most of the functionality anyway. But just note that it's not the number per se that is the problem. It is how many untrusted dependencies you're adding to your site.
So let's say I have a bad actor who notices that I've got some bad plugins or outdated software, and I find my way into the system. There's a number of different things that could happen, from, you know, maybe they make your front page look a little silly, and so you restore a backup, all the way to things as scary as a data breach. So when we have the concern of a data breach, what are some of the first things that we need to be thinking about? Again, coming to that playbook of mitigation, but also how do we further protect our reputation, but also the data of our customers at that point when we're dealing with something like a data breach?
If I could take that a few steps earlier than when the breach occurred, I think one of the things that I would be recommending that any individual or business do is actually get someone else, third party, in to have a look and do some level of audit, because I think it's actually really important. And it doesn't necessarily matter whether that's super detailed like ISO or whether that's quite surface level like a friend coming and poking around. It depends on the level of severity, the size of business, that sort of thing. But the reason I'm going back to that stage and recommending this is because it's really good to be exposed in a safe environment before you're exposed to the rest of the world. And so actually to force some of that exposure and to see some of the potential issues and some of the, the areas that would be vulnerable, the sort of data that could get out, it's really important to understand what that is early on, rather than waiting for something to go wrong and then realizing, oh my goodness, that's definitely something I didn't want the world to see. So I think I would take it from that perspective, and maybe the other guys are better at answering the what to do once it's happened sort of side.
Yeah, I'd also like to first take it a bit earlier. There's two things I want to mention here that tie into what you just said, Scott. One thing is that it's really important to actually be exposed, as you said. For example, the best backup in the world will not help you in any way if the recovery actually doesn't work. And a lot of sites never test their recovery process. So they religiously create their backups and think they're safe, but you're only safe if you actually test whether it helps you in the case of a problem. And it's the same with security. So all the security practices you put in place, if you never let someone else try to actually get past them, you don't know whether they work or not. It might just be that you have some vanity metrics and checklists filled out, but you left the door open in some other area. These things need to be directly tested by a third party to make sure that you didn't miss something obvious and that your practices actually work as expected. And then in the case of a data breach, it is before talking about what you're supposed to do, then it's important to know that the data breach is something that all the security best practices try to reduce the probability of that occurring in the first place. But there's never any guarantee. You're just lowering the probability of that happening. And there's still a remaining percentage of probability that it will happen. And that's where the preparations come into play of how to minimize the impact of a potential data breach. Because as you cannot fully secure yourself against a data breach, as there's always the theoretical possibility of it happening, you also should work on minimizing the impact of a data breach. And that's where data privacy and data governance come into play. In the security context, you can think about all the data that you're collecting. So this is, again, I think we're at the same space here where this is the negative of the marketing approach. So in marketing, all the data that you're collecting, it's pure value. You want to have as much data as possible. In terms of security, data is a liability, and you actually want to reduce the amount of data that you have. You want to reduce the amount of liability that you're collecting, because every data breach that will happen will directly be multiplied by the amount of data that you made accessible through that data breach. So if you start by not collecting data that is not needed, if you start by anonymizing and pseudonymizing, complicated work, by
I don't want to
anonymizing all the data that you don't need in the raw form, you can actually minimize the liability that you're exposing yourself to in the case of a data breach.
Yeah, and it's that classic, I suppose, idea of, you know, if you leave things visible in a window, it's going to make it more attractive to someone to try and steal them, right? So, you know, if you've got a form and you're collecting, you know, 27 attributes about a customer, an attacker is going to look at it and think, well, that's some really valuable data. If you're just collecting their kind of name and hair color, for example, that's not much use to anyone. So, you know, it comes back to that. Do you really need someone's date of birth? Do you really need to know kind of, you know, address details or, you know, whatever kind of information you need? And it really then reduces and reduces and reduces the value and the kind of desire for someone to attack and maybe steal that data. You know, and the process, you know, if the worst thing, you know, has happened, you know, I think there's various steps you go through in there. There's kind of technical steps and process steps, right? So, you know, it's a moment to panic, but don't panic, right? Because, you know, you need to keep a level head, you know, and a lot of it comes down to logging times, findings, as you're going through logs, as you're going through systems that may have been breached, you know, what is the state of that system at that point in time, tracking that time, what did you find, what's wrong, what isn't wrong. It's really kind of forensically going through access logs and, you know, who logged in, who didn't log in, you know, who made an update, who didn't make an update, you know, all the kind of things you'd go through as you so forensically going through everything, you know, and ultimately trying to get to a position where you're trying to find out what happened. You know, and, you know, say there's technical things you can do in terms of maybe putting up a holding page if you think there's something, you know, wrong with a particular URL that's just giving out data. You know, you can put up a holding page, you can turn off that particular site if you need to, you know, changing passwords to servers if you think the kind of leak has come from an internal source. You know, so you can go through all these steps, but I think the key thing is to really kind of keep a level head. You know, it's happened, it's bad, there's going to be repercussions, but you know, you need to make it stop. There's nothing, you know, don't panic kind of thing.
Yeah,
right,
there's also, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, in the interest of time, I'd love to get to some of our customer questions. Lexi and Luis have given us a pretty long list here. So I'm going to pick a couple and get your opinions on some of these. So the first one here, how to implement a serious content security policy or a CSP without breaking WordPress. Too many exceptions have to be put in place if it's serious, but then that makes it hard for WordPress to actually work. So what are your thoughts on the balance between security and functionality?
There's definitely a lot of areas in stock WordPress that could be built in a better way to make it easier to combine them with proper security practices. Generally, there's always ways of doing that. But for example, if we're talking about the WordPress backend, it is already behind an authentication wall. So probably you should start by separating your CSP policies between what you're doing on the front end and what you're doing on the back end in some way. That makes it easier to reason about these two different contexts and what you need to consider for them separately. And then on the back end, you are free to adapt in necessary ways, but also the backend can be secured in additional ways to make the network space for the backend safer. So you can, for example, build a system where the front end is accessible to the public World Wide Web, but your backend is not. So there's different ways of going about that, depending on how far you want to take it. You can have a demilitarized zone, you can have a VPN-only access, things like that. But generally, consider the WordPress backend to be separate from the WordPress frontend, even though they are being served by the same application, they are different security contexts.
So the next one, Scott, if you don't mind, I'm going to throw this one your way. I've seen this one asked a number of times. Does disabling a plugin in WordPress do the same thing as removing it or deleting it? Are they the same?
Oh my days, I am totally not technical enough to answer that question properly. So I'm gonna bounce, pass.
James or Alon, would you either of you like to take that one?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
well, I was
ahead.
going to say my WordPress experience is relatively limited, but I mean, just thinking of generally, it helps to disable it, but it doesn't do the job, right? You know, disabling it stops it from functioning, and if the module or plugin is built correctly, it's fine. But again, you're at that risk of knowing, did the person who built the plugin actually kind of build it properly, and are there other files that are potentially still accessible, even though the plugin has been disabled? But yeah, I mean, and then you probably have a better answer for that.
Yeah, in terms of security, disabling and deleting is two very different things. Disabling just means that it is not being loaded by WordPress by default, but the files are still present on the web server, and depending on what those files are and how the web server is configured, this can lead to all sorts of problems. So first of all, any static resource will still be available on its URL in the content folder, for example, because that folder is by its very nature publicly accessible, at least if you know the exact URL of these files. And then depending on how the web server is configured, if the web server is misconfigured, it can even lead to direct code execution of the plugin. That would mean the plugin is bad and the web server is badly configured. So you have more problems than not just deleting the plugin. But it means that in such a case, disabling the plugin will not remove any of the security issues. They will still be there as long as these files are present on the server. They can be remotely executed or whatever the initial issue was. So disabling has no impact on the files that are available through the web. Disabling just means that WordPress will not execute these PHP files in its normal execution flow.
For what it's worth, I knew the answer was delete. I'm just not smart enough to explain why.
The next one is a little more general, and it's related to backups. The original question was, are the backups stored on a separate server? I'm going to reword that a little bit. Is there a difference or an importance behind storing backups offsite versus storing backups on the same server where your website is? James, I saw you nodding first, so I'm going to throw that your way.
we all nodded. We all nodded. 100% right. So the point of a backup is to have a kind of point in time kind of freeze frame of where you were when that backup was taken. If that backup's stored on your server and your server is compromised via any means, then that backup then becomes potentially at risk, right? So whether removed or whatever. And what it also means is if your system is compromised but you don't know it's been compromised yet, and your backup still keep running, your backup now includes that whatever was compromised potentially. So keeping something offsite secures you against any kind of security issues that you're having with that server, but also any kind of disaster scenarios where that server in that particular geolocation goes down. I don't know, the data center disappears overnight, whatever. You've then still got your backup in a completely different site, and you can then kind of maintain your service via using that backup.
And one final one for today. As a small business administrator in-house, do you have a source on how to do an inventory of plugins, or I'll add how to do an inventory in general of your site? Is there anyone who would like to take that one on?
So from a simple level, and maybe someone else can answer the more detailed. So there's obviously log into the WordPress backend. As long as you're an admin or have access privileges to plugins, you should be able to see plugins. And it gives you a very simple list of what are the plugins that are installed, what's the status of those plugins, are those plugins enabled, disabled, do they need updates? That's sort of the simple place to sort of have a view of that. The other place you can go and look, I think, is under tools and site health. And that's a really good tool to run, to have a look at, what is the basic health of your site at this point in time, which is really useful information to be able to give to a developer or an agency to then do something potentially more useful with. And the other thing that I guess you could also do is run a third-party system. So, for example, Managed WP is a good one. I'm sure there are other tools available, but those sorts of tools will help you to sort of have a window into the site at any point in time as to what needs updating, what's the performance like. And I know that WP Engine's sort of got some tooling in that sense as well.
There you go. I'm going to go around my virtual room here and ask one by one if there's any closing thoughts. Alon, do you have any closing thoughts you'd like to provide to the audience today?
Yeah, I'd say I have two general recommendations. Try to outsource as much as you can of your security problems to experts in the field. It's not your core business, so you shouldn't deal with it if you can avoid it. Let experts do the hard stuff, and then always consider the impact of adding more to your site, be it more data or more code. Consider the impact, the implications in the long term of what that means, and see it always as a trade-off. Everything you do on your website is a trade-off. You're not just winning a new feature. You're doing a trade-off between one new feature versus one new security liability or something like that. So always consider the impact.
Yeah, I was just thinking of the same thing around the type of conversation I have with my clients and that we have with our clients as an agency at Illustrate Digital is around compromise. And that can be sometimes maybe a negative word to use, but I think it's a powerful one in this case, where we're actually saying to make a decision like this, you're compromising this. And actually to try and find the balance between the two different areas. You want to add this feature, but it could create some performance issues, security issues, whatever that may be. I would say don't be afraid to use the word compromise, because it is important to try to find the right answer and the balance between the two. Is it commercially more sensible but creates more risk and therefore commercially less sensible? And what is the output of those two things?
Yeah, I think my kind of final words are, this whole subject can be quite scary. There's lots of acronyms, there's lots of different types of attack. There's all sorts of negative kind of things going on here. I think if you look at it, a kind of more simpler approach, you can really apply it to what you do in your own life, right? You lock your front door, you lock your laptop when you walk away, you have a strong password, you go through all those things in your own life and how you live your own life. And if you apply lots of those same principles to how you build your network and your websites and applications, that's a lot of the work done for you. But I completely agree with the using experts in their fields. We can all do a job in security, but there are people that are actually, experts in it and use them.
I just want to say it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you all today. Thank you so much for joining and for allowing me to play along. Lexi, I'm going to turn it back over to you today.
Yes. Thank you so much. This was an amazing panel, and I think I can speak for everyone. It was fun. Like, I'm here giggling and laughing and agreeing and nodding my head. But we also had an unprecedented amount of questions. So thank you to everyone that joined. Keep an eye out for some follow-up and the recording. And also we'll see if we can crank out some additional resources to answer some of the outstanding questions. Thank y'all. Happy Wednesday.